At 64 years old, Ellis Rowan Mercer stood on a rotted porch in the Blue Ridge Mountains, holding a wooden stethoscope she had not touched in 32 years, and the people of Briar Hollow were already laughing at her behind their lace curtains. They saw a city woman in a tailored coat that did not fit the cold. They saw a Mercer come back to the hollow that had spit her family out 2 generations ago. They whispered that she would be gone before the first hard frost. But what they did not know was that the wooden stethoscope in her hand had belonged to her grandmother, that her grandmother had been the only midwife in 3 counties during the Depression, and that hidden inside the lining of her mother's old sewing box waiting at the top of the attic stairs was a stack of letters her mother had written, but never sent, each one addressed to the daughter she hoped would one day come home and find herself again. Before we go any further into Ellis's story, if you have ever been told that your best years were behind you, if you have ever quietly handed over your dreams to keep someone else's life running smoothly, take a moment now and subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories slowly, the way they were meant to be told, the way your grandmother might have told them on a porch swing in the long blue evening. Stay with us, settle in, let the world outside grow quiet. Now let us go back, all the way back, to a young woman in white standing in the fluorescent light of a Roanoke emergency room at 3 in the morning, with a man's life cradled in her steady hands. It was 1991. Ellis was 31 years old, 3 years into her career, already known on her floor as the nurse the doctors wanted at the difficult bedside. She had a way of slowing a panicked room down. She had hands that did not shake. She had been raised by a mother who said grace over breakfast, and a grandfather who taught her to set rabbit snares. And somewhere between those two influences she had learned that fear, like a startled horse, only needed someone calm in the room with it. That night in the ER, she brought a man back from the soft edge of dying. His wife wept into Ellis's shoulder for a full minute and called her an angel. Ellis went home in the gray hour before dawn, kicked off her shoes in the kitchen of her little rented apartment, and felt the kind of tire that is closer to joy than rest. Bernard Mercer was waiting on her couch with a ring. He had come up through the construction trade in the valley. A man who could read a blueprint the way a preacher reads scripture, 6'2" and built like a beam himself, with brown eyes that crinkled when he laughed and a way of saying her name that made her feel chosen. He had courted her for 9 months. He proposed on her kitchen floor while she stood there in her stained scrubs, smelling of antiseptic and coffee. And she said yes before he had even finished asking. They were married the spring she turned 32. By the autumn, she was carrying their first child. And that was when Bernie said the words that changed the shape of her life. His voice was gentle the first time. It was always gentle the first time. Ellis, sweetheart, you don't need to keep working those nights. We've got the money. A baby needs his mother home. She told him she loved her work. She told him she had spent 8 years and $12,000 in student loans to become what she had become. He nodded as if he understood. Then he said very softly, "And what kind of man would I be if my wife had to keep punching a clock while she's growing my son? People would talk Ellis. People would say I couldn't take care of my own family." It was not the words. It was the way he watched her face while he said them. The faint disappointment behind his eyes, like a man already grieving the wife he thought he had married. She let her name slip off the schedule at Roanoke Memorial. She told her supervisor it would only be for a year, maybe 2. She framed her nursing pin and hung it in the hallway. She told herself she would go back when the baby was old enough. Then Caleb was born. Then Marigold was born 18 months later. Then the years began to move the way years move when you are not watching them. Bernie's small construction firm became a larger one. The larger one swallowed a smaller competitor. Suddenly there were dinners to host, banquets to attend, contractors' wives to entertain in a dining room. Ellis polished herself. Suddenly, her nursing license lapsed, and renewing it felt like a foreign language she had stopped speaking. Suddenly, her children were tall and then taller, and then gone. And Ellis was standing in a kitchen in a four-bedroom house in West Roanoke, making coffee for a husband who did not look up from his phone to thank her. She told herself she had chosen this. She told herself 1,000 kindnesses about the life she was living. And on the days when something in her chest ached for the smell of an emergency room, she would press a hand over her sternum and breathe through it the way her mother had once breathed through grief. And she would do as her mother always said, the next right thing. The next right thing. Always the next one. Never the one after that. Never the whole staircase. Just the next step, the next plate, to wash the next shirt, to iron the next quiet day. It was a Tuesday in late September of 2024 when Bernie asked her to lunch. He took her to a place downtown with white tablecloths and a wine list he pretended to read. She wore the navy dress he had picked out at her birthday in July, the one he said made her look elegant rather than her age. She ordered a salad because the menu prices made her uneasy. He ordered a steak. He waited until the bread was on the table. And then he set a manila envelope between her water glass and her fork. And he said the word divorce with the same intonation a man uses to order a second drink. Ellis did not move. She did not cry. She looked at the envelope and then at the man across from her. And she thought absurdly of the way he had once pulled a thread loose from her sweater on their second date and tucked it neatly into his pocket so she would not see it on the floor. "Her name is Verity," he said when she did not speak. "She's an architect. We've been working closely on the Salem project. Ellis, sweetheart, I need you to understand. I'm 67 years old. I have one more chapter left in me. I need a partner who can stand in a room and have something to say." He poured her water as if that were a kindness. "You've been a wonderful mother. Nobody can take that from you. But this isn't a marriage anymore. This is a routine." She heard him from a great distance, the way one hears a radio in another room. She heard him say that his attorney had been drawing up papers for 4 months. She heard him say that the house was in his name, that the firm was in his name, that the retirement was in his name, and that he had been advised very strongly. Advised that her decades of running his home did not entitle her to anything beyond what he chose to give her. She heard him say a number. $60,000. He said it the way a man tips a valet. "You can have the house in Briar Hollow." He added, almost as an afterthought, "Your mother's old place. I had Verity look at the deed last spring. It's worth less than the back taxes. I'm signing it over. Call it a kindness." Ellis lowered her eyes to her hands. She saw with a strange clarity the soft brown spot that had appeared on the back of her left hand sometime in the last year, a spot she had not noticed until now. She thought, "My mother had a spot just like this. My mother had a spot just like this," and I never asked her how she felt about it. She did not finish the salad. She did not raise her voice. She walked out of the restaurant and drove home through traffic she did not see. And when she reached the empty driveway of the house she had kept beautiful for 32 years, she sat in her car with the engine running and let herself understand finally what had been done to her. In the courtroom 3 weeks later, the judge said the words "decree of dissolution" as if he were reading the weather. Bernie's lawyer was a tall, polished man with a wedding ring of his own. Ellis's court-appointed attorney was a tired young woman who had not had time to read the file. The judge looked at Ellis kindly when he handed down the settlement. $60,000, the deed to the property in Briar Hollow, Tucker County, West Virginia. The 2014 Subaru, her clothes, her books, her nursing pin in its frame. Bernie kept the rest. Outside the courthouse in a cold November wind that smelled of coming snow, Bernie touched her elbow as if they were still polite acquaintances. "You'll dry up in those hills, Ellis." he said almost gently, almost as if he believed he was warning her for her own good. Nobody up there even has cell signal. You'll be back in Roanoke begging for a spare room by Christmas. I want you to know there won't be one. He smiled the smile she had once mistaken for kindness. I hope you find peace. I really do. She watched him walk to his car. She watched Verity Hollings, a slim woman in a camel coat who could not have been more than 42, lean across the console to kiss him on the cheek. She watched them drive away, and she stood there in the courthouse wind with a paper sack of her own files in her hand. And she did not yet know it, but the woman who would walk away from that curb was a different woman than the one who had walked up to it. She drove west the next morning before the light was fully up. The road out of Roanoke climbed slowly at first through pasture and tobacco barns and old farms with peeling silos. Then it climbs faster into a country of laurel and rhododendron and dark pine where the ridges fold one behind another like blue paper cutouts. Ellis drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Somewhere past Bluefield, she crossed into West Virginia. Somewhere past Elkins, she turned onto a state road she had not driven since she was 19 years old, the year her grandmother was buried in the little churchyard at the bend of the river. The road narrowed. The trees closed over it. The signal on her phone blinked out just as Bernie had promised it would. Briar Hollow sat at the end of that road in a long fold of mountain. A town of 181 souls clustered around a feed store, a post office, a Baptist church with a leaning steeple and a single gas pump that served as a kind of town crier. She passed the feed store at a crawl. She felt eyes on her car the way a deer feels eyes on her at the edge of a meadow. By the time she reached the dirt track that led up to her mother's house, 3 porches in town had already heard that a silver Subaru with Virginia plates had come through, and a woman who looked like Lorelei Rowan, grown old, had been driving it. The house was worse than she had let herself imagine. It crouched at the end of the lane like an animal that had been left out in too many winters. The porch sagged on the left side where a post had rotted through. The tin roof had gone the color of an old nickel. A maple sapling was growing up through the front steps. The front door had warped in its frame, and when Ellis put her shoulder against it and pushed it, gave with a small defeated sigh, as if it had been waiting a long time to be opened. Inside there was the smell of mice and old paper, and the ghost of wood smoke from a stove that had not been lit in 2 years. Her mother's chair still sat by the cold hearth. Her mother's Bible was still on the side table, swelled fat with damp. Her mother's reading glasses lay folded on top of the Bible, as if Lorelei had only stepped out to fetch water from the spring. Ellis stood in the middle of the room, with her keys still in her hand. She did not cry. She did not sit down. She listened to the house. She heard a mouse move in the wall. She heard the wind press at the loose tin overhead. She heard beneath all of it the deep, slow breath of a house that had been waiting. The first week she did not so much live as endure. She slept under 3 blankets on the sagging couch because she could not bring herself to disturb her mother's bed. She washed her face in cold water from the kitchen pump because she did not yet trust the hot water heater. She ate canned soup heated on a single working burner. She walked into town once for kerosene and once for matches, and both times she felt the porch curtain stir as she passed. On the 3rd day she heard someone on her road, and she went to the window expecting Bernie, expecting his car, expecting her own old willingness to apologize for existing. It was not Bernie. It was a thin old woman in a black coat walking past the foot of the drive with a basket on her arm. She did not look up. She did not turn. She walked the way a person walks when she has decided that a house is not there. That Ellis would later learn was Hattie Pruitt. And Hattie Pruitt did not yet intend to let her be seen. On the 7th day she climbed the attic stairs. She did it without planning to. She had gone up to look for an extra quilt and found herself instead standing under the slanted roof beams in a wedge of dusty afternoon light. looking at the shapes of her family's history wrapped in old sheets and stacked against the eaves. Her grandfather's snowshoes, a churn, a child's school desk with the initials LR carved into the corner. Her mother's initials Lorelei Rowan, before she had ever been Lorelei Mercer's mother. A trunk with a brass clasp. Ellis knelt in front of the trunk for a long time before she opened it. When she lifted the lid, the smell that came up was cedar and old cotton, and something faintly herbal like the rosemary her grandmother had hung in bunches from the rafters of the spring house. Inside was her own life set aside. Her nursing school textbook, the spine cracked from study. Her diploma from the program at Virginia Western. The paper a little brittle now, the seal still bright. Her first stethoscope, the cheap student one with the cracked tube. A pressed cardinal feather she had forgotten she had kept. A photograph of her at 26 in a graduation cap, her arm around her mother, both of them squinting in the June sun. And beneath all of that, wrapped in a piece of soft white flannel, was the wooden stethoscope. It was a pinard horn, the kind a midwife used 100 years ago to listen to a baby's heart through a mother's belly. It had been her grandmother Hester's. Hester Rowan had walked these mountains in deep snow to bring living children into the world for 41 years. Ellis had held this little wooden tube exactly once when she was 7, and her grandmother had bent down and pressed it to her ear and said, "You hear that, Ellis girl, you hear the river. That's what a heart sounds like when it's not afraid." Ellis had never forgotten. She had not seen the stethoscope since the day they buried Hester. She held it now in both hands. She felt with a force that almost made her sit down the shape of the life she had given up. Beneath the flannel was a sewing box. The lid was loose. When Ellis lifted it, she saw a thick stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, each one written in her mother's tidy hand, each one addressed to Ellis, none of them with a stamp. Her hand shook a little as she pulled the ribbon loose. The letter on top was dated the spring of 2003. Ellis would have been 43 then. Caleb would have been 11. The paper had yellowed at the edges. Her mother's handwriting was as steady as her mother's voice had always been. Ellie sank down onto the attic floor, with her back against the trunk, and began to read. "My Ellis, I have been trying to write this letter for a year. Today I have decided to write it and not mail it because you would only argue with me, and because the words still belong to me, even if they never reach you. I want to tell you something I have never told a soul, not even your father. And it is this. I was a nurse. I was 23 years old, and I had a license and a job at the hospital in Beckley, and I gave it up for the same reason you gave yours up. Because the man who said he loved me told me I would be a better wife without it. I believed him. I believed him until the day I watched him die in the yard at 61 of a heart attack. I could not bring back with my own 2 trained hands trembling on his chest, because by then I had not been a nurse for 30 years, and I had forgotten the rhythm. I have never told you this, Ellis. I have never told you because I was ashamed. I am writing it now because I see in you the same softness I had at your age, and I do not want you to live my regret. The day will come, my girl, when you will need to choose yourself. When that day comes, I want you to remember that you come from a line of women who were called to heal, and that gift does not die. It only waits. Your grandmother's horn is in my cedar chest. It is yours. It has always been yours. Do the next right thing, Ellis, just the next one. Mama. Ellis read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat in the slanted attic light with her mother's letter in one hand and her grandmother's wooden stethoscope in the other. And she understood for the first time in her life that she had not chosen her smallness. She had inherited it. It had been pressed into the women of her family by the men they had loved, and her mother had carried that grief to the grave without ever once telling her daughter she was not alone. She did not weep. She would weep later. For now she sat very still, the way a woman sits when she has just heard her own life named aloud after 64 years of silence. There were 27 more letters beneath the first one. Ellis did not yet know what was in them. She wrapped the stack back in the blue ribbon. She put the wooden stethoscope into the pocket of her coat, where it sat against her hip like a small steady weight. She climbed down from the attic. She went to the kitchen and put a kettle on the burner that worked. And while she waited for the water to boil, she said her mother's words aloud to the empty room just to hear them in her own voice. Do the next right thing, just the next one. The kettle began to sing. That was the moment, although Ellis did not yet know it, when her old life ended and her new one began. She had been in Briar Hollow 9 days when the trouble at her door began. It started small, as all real trouble does. It started with a knock she did not expect. She opened the door in her mother's old apron, the wooden stethoscope still in her pocket because she had not been able to set it down. And there on the warped boards of her porch stood a man she had never seen before. A man of about her own age with iron-gray hair cut close to his skull and the long, careful hands of someone who built things slowly. He was holding a covered dish in a flour sack towel. He said his name in a voice softer than she had braced for. Wendell Briggs, I live up at the head of the holler. I knew your mother some. I brought you some chicken and dumplings. Folks in town said you hadn't come for groceries in a few days, and I thought you might could use a hot supper. Ellis stared at him. She had not been offered a kindness that did not come with a price in so long that for a moment she did not know how to receive one. She thanked him. She took the dish. She closed the door before he could see her face change. She did not yet know that Wendell Briggs would be the second person to save her life that autumn. She did not yet know that the first person had been her mother, writing letters that no one would mail 21 years before. She did not yet know that the third person, the one who would change her in ways she could not imagine, was a thin old woman in a black coat who would not look up at her house. She only knew that evening that someone in this forgotten hollow had carried her a hot meal up a rutted road for no reason she could yet name, and that the wooden stethoscope in her pocket suddenly felt less like a relic and more like the first quiet beat of something starting again. She set the dish on the table. She lit the lamp. She sat down to read the second letter. The second letter was dated 3 weeks after the first. Ellis read it by the kitchen lamp while the chicken and dumplings cooled in their towel, and she did not allow herself to open the dish until she had finished reading. It felt important to her in a way she could not have explained that the food not be eaten until the words had been heard. My Ellis, I want to tell you about your grandmother because I have come to believe that you do not know her the way you should. Hester Rowan delivered 411 babies in this county. She lost 9. She remembered each of the 9 by name until the day she died. She told me once when I was 11 years old and crying over a robin, I could not save that grief was the rent we paid for being useful. I did not understand her then. I understand her now. Mama. Ellis sat with that sentence for a long time. Grief was the rent we paid for being useful. She had paid it for 32 years and never noticed she was paying anything at all. She ate Wendell Briggs's dumplings standing at the sink, looking out the dark window at the yard where her grandmother's herb garden had once been. She could not see the garden in the dark, but she remembered it. She remembered rosemary and mountain mint and the bitter blue flowers of monkshood her grandmother used in salves and warned her never to touch. The next morning she ordered the textbooks. She used the post office in town because her phone still would not hold a signal up at the house, and she ordered them online from the postmaster's antique computer, while the postmaster, a heavy-set woman named Loretta Caldwell, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Caldwell, watched without comment. 2 refresher manuals for the West Virginia Nursing Board, a current pharmacology guide, a workbook for the NCLEX style review. The total came to $483. Ellis paid in cash from the envelope she had drawn out of the Roanoke Bank the morning she left. When she signed the receipt, Loretta Caldwell glanced at the name, and the writing pen stopped halfway down the page. Rowan. Loretta said softly, more to herself than to Ellis. You write your R the way your mama did. Ellis looked up. Loretta did not meet her eyes. She finished stamping the receipt and pushed it across the counter and turned her broad back and busied herself with a stack of mail that did not need sorting. Ellis walked out into the cold, the bell on the post office door ringing behind her. And she did not yet know that Loretta Caldwell had not slept that night for thinking about a girl named Lorelei Rowan and a secret she had carried alone since 1960. The books arrived 9 days later. Ellis cleared the kitchen table and set them out the way her mother used to set out canning jars at the start of August, each one in its place, each one waiting. She made coffee in her mother's percolator. She sharpened a pencil with a paring knife because she could not find a sharpener. She opened the pharmacology guide to chapter 1, and within 40 minutes, she was crying so quietly that the cat she did not yet own would not have heard her. The medication she had once known cold had been retired. The drugs that had replaced them had names she could not pronounce. The dosing protocols had changed. The cardiac algorithms had changed. Even the abbreviations had changed. QD was no longer used. PO was discouraged. A whole alphabet of her professional youth had been quietly thrown out, and a new alphabet had taken its place while she was ironing shirts and folding napkins and learning the names of contractors' wives. She closed the book. She walked outside in her slippers. She stood on the porch in the cold and pressed her palm flat against the wooden stethoscope in her sweater pocket, the way a frightened woman presses her hand against her own heart to feel that it is still there. The next right thing, she said to the empty trees. Just the next one. She went back inside and opened the book to chapter 1 again. She failed her first practice exam by a margin that humiliated her, even alone in her kitchen. 41%. She failed the second one 10 days later by 2 points less. She studied at the kitchen table by the lamp until her eyes burned, and she studied on the porch in the thin November sun until her fingers stiffened, and she fell asleep in her mother's chair with the workbook open across her chest, and woke at 3 in the morning to a stove that had gone cold and a sentence she had been trying to memorize about beta blockers still circling in her head. In the second week of November, the cold came down hard out of the mountains, and Wendell Briggs came back. He came without warning. The way she would come to learn, he did everything, and he brought 2 cords of split hardwood in the bed of an old red Ford pickup that listed to one side as if it had been listing for 30 years. He did not knock. He stacked the wood against the south wall of her house in neat rows that took him most of an afternoon, and when she came out to ask what he thought he was doing, he straightened up and rubbed the small of his back and looked at her with the patience of a man who had spent his life shaping wood and waiting for it to dry. Your mama always burned cherry first, he said it sweetened the house. I cut some last spring and let it season. Thought you might could use it. Ellis stood on the porch with her arms folded. She had spent 32 years married to a man who did not give anything without expecting it counted. She did not know how to receive a gift that came with no ledger. What do I owe you? She said, and her voice came out harder than she meant it. Wendell Briggs looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the color of the river in March gray with a little brown underneath. You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Mercer, he said. That's not how it works up here. He paused. And you're a Rowan, by the way, not a Mercer. Whoever told you different was lying. He touched the brim of his cap. He climbed back into the red truck. He drove away down the rutted lane without looking back, and Ellis stood on her porch holding the doorframe because her knees had gone just for a second soft beneath her. That night, the temperature dropped to 19 degrees. And Ellis lit her first fire in her mother's wood stove in 2 years, and the house began very slowly to remember the shape of warmth. She passed her third practice exam by a single point. She passed her fourth by 6. She passed her fifth by 11, and on the morning she passed her sixth with a 78. She walked outside into the December cold in her bare feet and stood in the dead garden and laughed once, a short, surprised, almost angry laugh. The laugh of a woman who has just discovered that something she had been told was gone forever was only sleeping. In December, she registered for the board exam in Charleston. The earliest seat she could get was the 15th of February. She paid the fee. She drove home in a sleet that came sideways across the ridges, and when she pulled into her lane, she saw a brown paper sack on the porch step. Inside was a jar of apple butter, a loaf of bread still warm under a dish towel, and no note. The next week, there was a bundle of split kindling on the porch. The week after that, a small canvas bag of pinto beans, a bag of cornmeal, and a half-pound of bacon wrapped in white butcher paper. The week after that, a quart of cream from someone's home cow with a single sprig of rosemary laid across the lid. Ellis did not know who was leaving the gifts. She did not see anyone come. She would come back from the post office or from town and find another small offering set down quietly, the way a person sets down an apology that has nothing to do with words. She began by the third week to leave a chair on the porch with a folded blanket on it because she could not bring herself to thank no one in particular. But she could at least offer no one in particular a place to sit. The first time she actually used the wooden stethoscope was on a cold Thursday morning in early January on a child she had not been looking for. She had walked down to the feed store to ask after a kerosene shipment. The store was warm with the smell of grain and creosote. A boy of about 8 years old was sitting on the bench by the wood stove, his face the color of skim milk, his breath coming fast and shallow, his small ribs working in a way Ellis's hands recognized before her mind did. His grandmother, a woman in a too-thin coat, was holding his hand and trying to keep her voice steady. "He just gets like this sometimes, ma'am," the grandmother was saying to the man behind the counter. "We're waiting on his daddy to come down off the mountain with the truck." Ellis was across the room before she had decided to move. She knelt down on the gritty floor in front of the bench. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask permission. She put 2 fingers under the boy's jaw and felt the racing thread of his pulse, and she said very calmly, "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" "Asa," he whispered. "Asa, I'm going to listen to you breathe. Is that all right?" She drew the wooden pinard horn out of her coat pocket and pressed the wide end gently to his thin chest through his shirt, and put her ear to the narrow end the way her grandmother had taught her at 7 years old, and she closed her eyes, and she listened. She heard what she had been afraid she might hear. The high musical whistle on the long edge of his outbreath, the wet rattle underneath. A child in the middle of a hard asthma attack in a feed store at the bottom of a mountain 28 miles from the nearest emergency room. She lifted her head. She looked at the grandmother. She kept her voice very low and very steady, because she had learned a long time ago in a Roanoke trauma bay that calm was contagious, and so was panic. "Ma'am, does Asa have a rescue inhaler at home?" The grandmother's eyes filled. "He had one. We couldn't afford the refill last month." Ellis nodded once as if she had been expecting that answer. "All right, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're going to do 3 things. She kept her hand light on the boy's knee. "First, we're going to sit him up tall, not lying back tall. Second, we're going to ask Mr. Hensley behind the counter to please bring us a paper sack and a cup of warm water with a spoon of honey in it. Third, you're going to drive Asa and me to the urgent care in Parsons in your truck right now, while I sit in the back seat with him, and we breathe slow together. I am a nurse. I have done this many times. Asa is going to be all right, but we need to go." The grandmother stared at her. The man behind the counter stared at her. For a long second, Ellis felt the whole feed store turn into the kind of held silence she remembered from every code she had ever run. Then the grandmother said, "Yes, ma'am," and stood up, and the man behind the counter grabbed his keys and said, "Take my Bronco, Edna. Your truck won't make it past the bridge in this slick." And they were out the door inside of 2 minutes. Ellis in the back seat with the boy half on her lap, her hand on his small heaving back, her voice in his ear low and even. "Breathe in with me, Asa, that's right. Hold it now. Slow out, slow as the river in summer. That's right. That's my boy." Slow as the river. He was breathing easier by the time they reached the Parsons clinic. He was pink again by the time the nurse on duty had him on a nebulizer. The clinic doctor came out into the waiting room afterward, a tired-looking man of about 40, and shook Ellis's hand and said, "Ma'am, you knew what you were doing. Are you on staff somewhere local?" "No," Ellis said, "not yet." She rode back to Briar Hollow in the front seat of the Bronco beside Mr. Hensley, the grandmother, and Asa in the back, the wooden stethoscope warm in her pocket, her hands shaking only now the way her hands had always shaken, only after a survey and never during one. Word in a place like Briar Hollow does not travel, it detonates. By the next afternoon, 2 women she had never met stopped her on the road into town to thank her. By the end of the week, the brown paper sack on her porch had a half-pound of butter in it, and a note that read in a careful schoolteacher hand, "Thank you for our Asa." By the second week of January, when Ellis walked into the post office to mail a study aid she had borrowed back to the library in Elkins, Loretta Caldwell came out from behind the counter for the first time since Ellis had met her, and put her broad, warm hands on Ellis's shoulders and looked her in the face. "Honey," Loretta said. Her eyes were wet. "I have to tell you something. Sit down, please, sit down." Ellis sat down on the bench by the postcard rack. Loretta sat beside her. She held both of Ellis's hands in her own. "Your mama was my first cousin," she said. Ellis stopped breathing. "My mama and her mama were sisters," Loretta said. "Your great-aunt Effie was my mother. There was a fight in 1960 between your grandmother Hester and Effie over a piece of land down by the river. Hester was right and Effie was wrong, and Effie went to her grave without admitting it. And she made my mama swear never to speak the Rowan name in our house again. I kept that promise for 64 years, Ellis. I kept it even when your mama would come into this post office to mail you a birthday card. I kept it even when I saw you walk in here in November, and I knew the second I saw you write your name who you were. I am ashamed of myself. I'm here today to tell you that you have family in this hollow. You always have had. And I am so sorry that nobody told you." Ellis did not speak. She could not. She sat on the bench in the post office with a woman she had passed 3 times without knowing. She was looking at her own blood, and she felt something tilt inside her chest very slowly, the way a heavy door tilts open when it has been pushed against for a long time. She walked home in a daze. She climbed the attic stairs. She read 3 more of her mother's letters by the failing light, and in the 7th one, dated 2007, she found this line: "There are people in Briar Hollow who are my kin, Ellis, and they have been told not to know me. One day when the silence breaks, it will break on you, and you will not know what to do with it. Be gentle with them. They were children when the lie began. They did not choose it." Ellis pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and wept finally, the way she had not allowed herself to weep since the day Bernie had set the manila envelope on the white tablecloth. In the last week of January, the thin old woman in the black coat came up the lane. Ellis saw her from the kitchen window. Hattie Pruitt did not stop at the porch. She walked up to the side of the house where the herb garden had been, and she stood there in the snow for a long time, looking at the dead beds. Then she turned very slowly and looked at the kitchen window, and Ellis felt the woman's eyes on her face the way one feels the touch of a cold hand. She went outside without her coat. Hattie Pruitt was a woman of about 78, with a face that had been carved by grief, the way wind carves a fence post. Her hands were folded in front of her. She did not soften her voice. "You're working at being your grandmother," she said. "I want you to know I'm not going to let you." Ellis did not flinch. She had been flinched at for 32 years. She had no more flinches left to give. "All right," she said. "Tell me why." Hattie's mouth worked. She did not speak for a long moment. "In the spring of 1962, she said, I sent my husband out in the rain to fetch your grandmother Hester for a hard labor. I was 16 years old. The river was high. Hester could not come across. My baby died on my kitchen floor with the cord around his throat, and Hester Rowan did not come until the morning. She buried him under the dogwood with her own 2 hands. And she said the words because the preacher would not come up the road in the mud. And I have hated the Rowan women ever since because hating them was easier than hating the river." Hattie's voice did not break. It only thinned. "Now you have come up here with a horn in your pocket, and you have saved Edna Whitlow's grandboy in the feed store, and people are starting to say the Rowans have come back. And I am here to tell you, Ellis Mercer, that I am not ready for the Rowans to come back, and I do not know if I ever will be." Ellis stood in the snow in her socks. The cold was beginning to climb her ankles. She did not feel it. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "I am sorry. I am so sorry for your boy. I did not know." Hattie nodded once. She turned. She walked back down the lane the way she had come. Ellis went inside and sat on the kitchen floor, with her back against the stove for a long time, and she did not study that night, and she did not eat. She held the wooden stethoscope in both hands, and she thought about a 16-year-old girl on a kitchen floor in 1962, and she understood with a clarity that hurt that the gift she was trying to take up again had a debt on it she had not known about. She passed the board exam on the 15th of February. She drove home through a snow that fell so softly the windshield wipers did not need to work. She had her certificate beside her on the passenger seat in a manila envelope, the kind of envelope that had once carried a divorce decree. And she turned the radio on for the first time since she had left Roanoke and listened to an old country station out of Buckhannon all the way home. When she pulled into the lane, there was a man on her porch. For one terrible second, she thought it was Bernie. Then she saw the iron-gray hair and the long, careful hands and the dulcimer case at his feet. And she let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Wendell Briggs had brought his instrument because he said when she got out of the car and walked up the steps, he had a feeling she might want some music tonight. She did not ask him how he knew about the exam. In Briar Hollow, nobody had to ask. They sat on the porch in the cold blue evening. He played a slow tune she half remembered. She did not speak. After a while, he set the dulcimer down across his knees. "My wife Junie died 11 years ago this March," he said. "Postpartum hemorrhage. The ambulance took 47 minutes to get up our road. There wasn't a nurse in this hollow that night. There hasn't been one for a long time." He looked at her. "I'm not saying that to make you carry anything, Ellis. I am saying it because you asked me that first day what you owed me, and I told you nothing, and that was true. But I want you to know why I brought the wood." Ellis did not answer right away. The wooden stethoscope was a small, steady weight in her coat pocket. The certificate sat on the porch boards between them, white in the dusk. "Wendell," she said, "I would like you to come in for supper." He came in for supper. It was the night of the 28th of February when the phone she had finally gotten to work on the single bar of signal that lived only on the east end of her porch rang at 1:20 in the morning. Ellis sat straight up in bed. The voice on the other end was a man's breaking very young. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Junior Pruitt. Hattie's boy. Mama's down. She can't get her breath. The ambulance dispatcher said an hour at best. Please, please, I know what she said to you. Please." Ellis was already pulling on her coat over her nightgown. "I'm coming," she said. "Tell her I am coming. Do not let her lie flat. Sit her up. I will be there in 11 minutes. She grabbed her bag. She grabbed the wooden stethoscope from the kitchen table where it had been resting beside the certificate. She did not bother with shoes that buckled, only her grandmother's old rubber boots by the door. She ran for the Subaru in a snow that had started up again at midnight, fine and quiet as flour. And as she turned the key, she said aloud to no one and to everyone, to her mother and her grandmother and the 16-year-old girl on the kitchen floor in 1962. The same 5 words she had been saying for 4 months now. The next right thing. The Subaru's headlights cut a thin tunnel through the snow. The road to Hattie Pruitt's house climbed and turned and climbed again. Ellis drove with both hands on the wheel and the wooden stethoscope warm against her ribs where she had tucked it inside her coat. And she did not yet know what she would find on that kitchen floor. And she did not yet know that her son Caleb had picked up his cell phone at 1:20 in the morning in Roanoke, 300 miles away, and called his father with news that would set Bernie Mercer driving west by dawn. The Pruitt house sat in a clearing of dark spruce at the head of a road that had not been graded in a decade. Ellis came up the last grade in second gear, the Subaru's tires biting and slipping, and she saw the porch light burning yellow through the snows before she saw the house itself. Junior Pruitt was waiting on the porch in his shirt sleeves with his arms wrapped around himself. A boy of maybe 22 who looked in that yellow light. Like every frightened son she had ever met on every night shift she had ever worked. She did not waste words. She took the steps 2 at a time with her bag over her shoulder and the wooden stethoscope pressed flat against her sternum under her coat. Where is she? Kitchen. She wouldn't go to the bed. She said she wanted to be where she could see the door. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and bacon grease and the metallic edge that comes off a body when the heart is failing. Hattie Pruitt sat in a high-back chair by the table in a flannel nightgown, her thin gray braid over one shoulder, her hands clenched white on the chair arms, her chest pulling in the small fast pulls of a woman who was running out of room to breathe. Ellis knelt down in front of her on the linoleum. She did not announce herself. She put 2 fingers under Hattie's jaw and felt the pulse fast and weak, a thready running thing. She put the wide end of the pinard horn against Hattie's chest, through the soft flannel and her ear to the narrow end, and she listened to a heart that was beating like a small wild bird against a window. Acute pulmonary edema, probable left-sided heart failure. The kind of crisis Ellis had managed perhaps 200 times in a Roanoke trauma bay with a full crash cart at her elbow, and was now going to manage in a kitchen on a mountain with a flannel nightgown and a wooden horn and 43 minutes between her and the nearest paramedic. She lifted her head. She looked into Hattie Pruitt's eyes. The old woman's eyes were lit with terror, but they were also clear, and they were on Ellis's face. And Ellis understood in that one held second that the woman who had sworn never to let a Rowan back into her life had picked up the telephone tonight, because somewhere underneath 62 years of grief, she had decided that she wanted to live. "Hattie," Ellis said, low, steady, the voice she had used 1,000 times on 1,000 frightened patients. "I am here. I see what is happening. You are going to be all right. I need you to do exactly what I say." Hattie's lips moved. No sound came out. Her eyes did not leave Ellis's face. "Junior," Ellis said without looking away from his mother. I need 3 pillows from her bed. I need a teaspoon and the bottle of aspirin out of her medicine cabinet. I need a kitchen chair set behind her with a folded quilt on it. I need the kitchen window cracked 2 inches. Go, he went. Ellis got Hattie's feet down off the chair rung and onto the cold floor the way you do when you need to pull fluid out of a chest. She loosened the buttons at Hattie's throat. She talked the whole time, not because Hattie needed the words, but because Ellis had learned on a long-ago night her grandmother had foreshadowed without ever knowing it, that a steady voice in a kitchen could do almost as much as a drug. You are doing the work, Hattie. You are doing it. Breathe with me. In through the nose, slow out through the mouth, slower. That is right. That is exactly right. Junior came back with the pillows and the aspirin. Ellis cracked an aspirin tablet between her teeth and pressed the pieces into Hattie's mouth. She propped the pillows behind the old woman's shoulders so that she was sitting almost upright. Her chest opened the work of her diaphragm, given as much room as a kitchen chair could give it. She put 2 fingers back on Hattie's wrist and counted. She counted for 90 seconds. Then she counted for another 90. By the third count, the pulse had begun very slowly to thicken under her fingertips. The thready bird quieting just a little, the rate coming down out of the high catastrophe she had heard in the wooden horn. Hattie's eyes had not left her face the entire time. There you are, Ellis said softly. There you are, Mrs. Pruitt. Stay with me. The ambulance arrived in 51 minutes. They found a woman who was breathing on her own, sitting up in a kitchen chair. Alive enough to be furious at the cold the paramedics let in when they opened the door. They took Hattie down the mountain in the dark with Ellis riding in the front of the rig, because the senior paramedic, a man of about 50 with a graying mustache, took one look at the wooden pinard horn around her neck on its leather string and said, "Ma'am, you ride with us. You are the only reason this lady is still talking." In the hallway outside the Parsons emergency room at 4 in the morning, Junior Pruitt sat with his elbows on his knees and cried quietly into his hands. Ellis sat beside him without speaking. After a while, he wiped his face with the heel of his palm and said without looking at her, "She told me one time about your grandmother, about the baby." He paused. He gathered himself. "She didn't tell me everything. She told me your grandma came back the next morning, walked all the way back across the river when the water went down, dug the grave in the dogwood roots herself because the ground was hard, said the Lord's Prayer because the preacher wouldn't come. Mama said she never told another soul that part. She said hating was easier." Ellis did not answer. She did not trust her voice. It was full daylight when Hattie Pruitt was wheeled out of the treatment bay into a regular room color, back in her face an oxygen cannula at her nose. She was a small woman in a too large hospital gown, and she looked in the gray morning light like a person who had been given something back she had not expected to be given. Ellis stood at the foot of the bed. Hattie lifted one thin hand and beckoned her closer. Ellis came. Hattie took her hand. Her grip was weak, but it was certain. She did not let go. "Your grandmother," Hattie said. Her voice was a rasp. "Came back the next morning. Buried my boy with her own hands. I never said his name out loud after that day. His name was Wyatt." Her eyes shone with 62 years of unshed water. "Wyatt Pruitt, I want you to know it. I want somebody to know it." "Wyatt Pruitt," Ellis said. "I will not forget." Hattie nodded. She closed her eyes. She held on to Ellis's hand for a long time, and Ellis stood at the side of the bed and did not move, and she felt in the warm hospital room with the heater clicking, on something break open in the long-shut room of her own chest, where she had kept her own 40 years of silence. She drove home in the bright cold of a March morning. The snow had stopped. The ridges were a clean blue. She did not turn the radio on. When she came around the last bend before her lane, she saw a silver sedan parked at the foot of her drive. Bernard Mercer was standing beside it in a coat she had bought him for Christmas 8 years ago. Ellis did not slow down. She did not speed up. She pulled the Subaru in past him parked at the porch, got out with her bag in her hand, and walked up her own steps without looking at him. She heard him follow her up the lane on foot. She heard his shoes slip a little in the snow. She did not turn. She set her bag inside the door. She left the door open. She turned and stood on her own porch and faced him. He had aged. She saw that first. He had aged in a way that money does not slow down. There were new pouches under his eyes. The skin along his jaw had loosened. He had lost weight in the chest and gained it at the waist, and the coat she had once chosen for him hung wrong now, in a way that surprised her with its small, sad evidence. "Ellis," he said. She did not answer. "Caleb called me," he said, "last night. He said you were out delivering some old woman from the dead in the middle of a snowstorm. I drove all night." He attempted a smile. It did not arrive. "I needed to see you." She did not answer. "Verity is gone," he said. She watched him. "The firm is gone too. There were loans I didn't tell you about. Loans against the firm, loans against the house, loans against the retirement. Verity took the operating account on Valentine's Day and went somewhere with my comptroller. I am told they are in Belize." He laughed once, a small bitter sound. "It turns out I was not as clever as I thought I was. It turns out you were the one keeping the book straight." He looked at her. "I am 67 years old, Ellis. I have nothing. I have nothing but a paid-off car and a coat my wife bought me. I came up here to tell you I was wrong. I came up here to tell you I have thought about you every day. I came up here to ask you, please, to let me come home." He took a step toward the porch. Ellis lifted her hand. He stopped. It was a small gesture. She had not planned it. Her hand had simply gone up the way a woman's hand goes up to stop traffic. And what surprised her more than anything that had been said, was that her hand was not shaking. There was a sound behind her on the road. She did not turn to look. She did not need to. She knew the way a woman knows the weather, that the people of Briar Hollow had heard, in the way that Hollow always heard, that a silver sedan with Virginia plates was parked at the foot of Ellis Rowan's lane. She knew that Wendell Briggs had walked down from the head of the holler in his work boots. She knew that Loretta Caldwell had closed the post office in the middle of a Tuesday morning and come up the road in her old brown Chevrolet. She knew that Junior Pruitt was standing on his porch a mile away, with the phone in his hand, listening to a friend describe what was unfolding. She knew that Edna Whitlow was at the foot of the lane with her grandson Asa beside her, and that Asa was holding her hand the way a child holds the hand of a woman he is no longer afraid he is going to lose. Ellis Rowan stood on her own porch, and she looked at the man who had once been her husband, and she spoke very quietly because she did not need to be loud. "Bernie," she said, "you did not lose me. You never had me. You had a woman who had been taught to make herself small enough to fit in the room you had built for her. That woman died in a courthouse in Roanoke in November. I have buried her. She's not coming back." He opened his mouth. She did not let him speak. "You came up here because you have nothing. I understand that. I am not unmoved by it. I am going to wish you well because my mother taught me to wish people well even when they have hurt me, and because hating you would be a rent I am not willing to pay anymore." She drew the wooden stethoscope out from inside her coat and held it loosely in her hand at her side, not as a weapon, not as a banner, only as a thing that belonged to her. "But you are not coming home. There is no home here for you. The home you remember was a house I kept warm for a man who did not see me. This house is mine. The woman in it is mine. I do not give either of them back. She lowered her voice further. The cold air carried it cleanly down the lane. Go to Caleb. He has a guest room. He will not turn you out. Be kind to him. Be the father you were not. That is the only way back to anything good that is left to you. It is not through me. Bernie stood in the snow at the foot of her steps. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face that had been hard for 40 years went for 1 second soft, and Ellis saw briefly the boy he must have been before he had decided that the world owed him a kingdom. He nodded once. He did not speak. He turned and walked down the lane to the silver sedan. He drove away slowly, the way a man drives when he is no longer in a hurry to arrive anywhere. The people of Briar Hollow did not cheer. They did not move. They stood in the lane the way mountain people stand at a graveside witnessing. After a long moment, Wendell Briggs came up the steps. He did not touch her. He stood beside her at the porch rail and looked out at the ridges that were beginning to lose their morning blue. "You did that well, Ellis Rowan," he said. She let out a long breath she felt she had been holding since she was 28 years old. "I had practice," she said. 64 years of practice. It was the first time she had laughed in front of him. It was a small laugh. He laughed too. The spring came on slowly that year. The way spring comes on in the high mountains in little advances and small retreats. A warm day followed by a cold one, a thaw, and then a late snow. The dogwoods making up their minds in a way that took weeks. By the first week of May, the herb garden had begun to come back. Ellis had planted it in February by lamplight from seed packets she had ordered out of a catalog, and from cuttings Loretta Caldwell had brought up the road in a coffee can. Rosemary where her grandmother had grown rosemary. Mountain mint where her grandmother had grown mountain mint. Lemon balm, lavender, yarrow. A small careful row of calendula because her mother's third letter had mentioned that Hester used to set the orange flowers on a windowsill in late summer just to look at them. She had not planted monkshood. The blue flower her grandmother had used and warned her against would not come back to this garden. Some inheritances Ellis had decided were not meant to be passed on. The little clinic opened on the 1st of June. It opened in the front room of her house, the room her mother had once used for sewing, with a hand-lettered sign Wendell had carved and hung beside the door. It read, simply, Rowan. There was no other word on the sign. The people of Briar Hollow did not need another word. They came on foot and in old trucks, and once memorably on a mule. Ellis kept a sliding fee. The fee for most of her patients was a jar of jam, a cord of wood for the stove, an afternoon of someone's grandson clearing brush behind the house. The fee for some was nothing at all. She made it work. Hattie Pruitt came every Wednesday for a blood pressure check and stayed for coffee. She and Ellis did not talk much about 1962. They did not need to. Once in late June, Hattie brought a small dogwood seedling in a coffee can and asked Ellis if she would plant it at the corner of the herb garden. Ellis did. Neither of them said the name Wyatt out loud while they planted it. Both of them heard it anyway. Marigold called in July. She did not lead with the apology, but the apology came slowly over the course of an hour. She had read, she said, an old journal she had found in a box in her father's garage when she went over to help him pack up the house he was losing. She had read what her mother had written in 1995 about a bad night and a worse morning, and a young marriage that had bruised her in places no one had seen. She did not know, Marigold said. She had not known. She was sorry. She wanted to come up and see the garden. She wanted to bring her own daughter, who was 4 now, and who had Ellis's eyes. Ellis said yes. Caleb came in August with his father in the passenger seat. Bernie did not come up to the porch. He sat in the car and looked at the ridges for a long time. And after an hour, Caleb walked back down the lane and they drove away. Ellis stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust of their leaving settle in the road. And she did not feel triumph, and she did not feel grief. Only the steady weight of a chapter that had been allowed at last to close. On a clear evening in September, almost exactly a year from the Tuesday, she had sat across a white tablecloth and watched a manila envelope slide toward her water glass, Ellis. Rowan stood on her porch with Wendell Briggs beside her, and a wooden pinard horn on a leather string around her neck, and looked out at her garden in the last light of the day. The rosemary was tall, the lavender had gone to seed and was humming with bees. The lemon balm had sprawled the way lemon balm will. The yarrow stood white and tall against the back fence. The calendula on the windowsill was as orange as her mother had said it would be. The little dogwood at the corner of the bed had taken root and put out its first green leaves, and Hattie Pruitt was sitting on the porch step beside Loretta Caldwell, snapping green beans into a blue enamel bowl, and Asa Whitlow was chasing a barn cat through the dooryard with the boundless, useless joy of a child whose lungs do their work without thinking. And Wendell's old red Ford was parked in the lane with 2 cords of hardwood for the winter already split and stacked along the south wall. Somewhere in the spruce a thrush was singing. The long evening song mountain thrushes sing only at dusk, only in the high country, only when the air is cool and the day has been good. Ellis touched the wooden horn at her throat. "Mama," she said softly, only to herself, only to the dusk. "I did the next right thing. I just kept doing it. Just the next one, like you said." Wendell did not ask her what she had said. He only put his hand work-roughened and warm very lightly on the small of her back. The thrush sang again. The sun went down behind the Blue Ridge of West Virginia, and the first star came out over the dogwood and Ellis Rowan, who had been told at 64 that her best years were behind her, breathed in the smell of rosemary and wood smoke and damp earth, and was finally fully and completely at home in her own life. If you stayed with Ellis all the way to this porch, all the way to this dusk, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for sitting with a woman who was told she was nothing and discovered slowly in her own grandmother's garden that she had always been a healer with a name. If a part of her story sounded like a part of yours, if you have ever been handed a manila envelope across a table, if you have ever climbed a set of attic stairs and found a letter that knew you better than the people in your living room, if there is a wooden horn of your own in a box somewhere waiting for you to take it out, leave one word in the comments. One word. The name of the thing you set down a long time ago and have been quietly carrying anyway. We will read every one, because there are nights in places like Briar Hollow and in places nothing like it, when somebody on a porch needs to hear that the gift is not gone. It is only waiting. It is always only waiting. And the next right thing is always, always the very next one. Sleep gently. We will see you in the next story.